think that we've also talked about misconceptions that mid-sized manufacturers might have, such as feeling like they need a $5 million budget to get started with some of these projects. Talk to us about that, because I'm sure that's changed as well over time too, where maybe 5 years ago you needed a fairly sizable budget to get started with some of these new initiatives and projects, but I'm sure that's come down quite a bit. What are you seeing right now? What's sort of a good budget to be targeting? Is there like an annual revenue for a company that you think is a right fit to get started with these projects? Love to hear your thoughts.
I don't think so. I don't think you have to be a $100 million business or a $10 million business or whatever. I don't think that's how this works, in my opinion. I am glad you brought this up, because I was eventually going to try to bring us there too. So thank you. I do think one of the largest barriers as well is the misconception that it costs a boatload of money to get started with some form of digital transformation or smart manufacturing effort. 10 years ago, 8 years ago, yeah, you probably would have had to spend a lot more than you would have to spend today. Over the last, let's say 5 to 8-ish years, there have been a tremendous amount of ISVs or independent software vendors that have come out with applications that do some really, really incredible things. Some are cloud-based if you want that cloud access and visibility across plants and things like that. Some are on-prem. Totally just depends what you have an appetite for from a deployment perspective, right? But point is, there are many applications today that are very easily consumable and priced what I would say in a very consumable and palatable fashion that even the smallest of players can embrace them. And that's everything from ERP systems all the way down to very pointed solutions that do things like visual inspection for anomaly detection or quality inspection, or time series mining tools that can sit right on top of your historian, or just getting a historian to store data, right? The possibilities are quite limitless, but totally agree with your point. It doesn't cost millions of dollars to get started. In some instances, it can just cost a couple $1,000s to get started. In some instances, it doesn't even cost that, depending on what you're trying to do, right? If you want to do some basic temperature sensing or humidity sensing as it relates to, a part of your process, you could run a POC or a proof of concept on a Raspberry Pi for about $50 and start streaming temperature data, right? Super easy. The question is it valuable enough for your business, right? Like what are you going to get out of knowing the temperature data? And then that kind of brings us into another part of the discussion that I'll talk about in a second. But what's your take on that? What do you think? Are you aligned with some of my comments?
Totally. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I think for me the question is, do you first set aside a budget and say like, okay, we're going to set aside $100K or $150K this year to explore digital transformation projects, analytics projects, ML projects, and see where we land? Or do you first go through the use case assessment process to see how much value can be potentially untapped? Because if you start with the budget first and the cost side first, you may be overlooking big time bottlenecks within your operation that may be much higher than what you're thinking, and you may be overlooking those opportunities. And so I go back and forth on this. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, but I think in some instances there's just a lot of value that is being left on the table, and if you could demonstrate that value and say, hey, if we invest in this is going to unlock $2 million worth of additional revenue for us over the next 2 years. Okay, it makes sense. It makes sense for us to put $200K on this right away. That's going to be a great payback period. So we would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm a big believer in proving out the value, or at least mapping out the value before you go and seek budget. To your point, actually, you summed it up really, really well. If you go blindly and ask leadership for 20 grand or 50 grand or 100 grand, and then you're going to figure out what you're going to do with it, right? That's a very different story than going to your leadership and saying, hey, I figured out a way that I can generate or save or fill in the blank X amount of dollars. This is what it's going to take to do that, right? The beauty of being a small and medium business, by the way, because that's really the focus of this discussion, typically that can happen a lot easier in a small and medium-sized business than a massive enterprise where you have budgeting cycles and you're already planning for the next year at this point, and there's a lot of organizational navigating you have to do in order to try to get your budget through, and you have to lobby with different executives if you're not a P&L owner or an executive yourself, right? So it can be very challenging versus the smaller and medium-sized businesses. Generally speaking, it can be much easier to go to the owner, to go to one of the key stakeholders within the organization and say, hey, look, this is what I did. This is what I found out. Do we have an appetite to invest in something like this? Right? It can be quite a bit easier, which also gives you the advantage if you're a small or medium-sized business, because that means you can start doing things a lot quicker than the bigger players, right? So I do think that's really important to note. Back to the original question around, do you budget or do you plan, for the use case first? So I did answer that part, but I will say there are two core components when you're trying to evaluate essentially the value, right, that you're going to get from this effort. You have to look at, of course, the ROI. That's what everyone talks about, right? Where's the ROI? ROI, that's return on investment, right? If anyone's not familiar with the acronym. So if I invest X amount of dollars into this project, what am I going to get out of that? How long is it going to take me to get my capital investment back? And then when do I start seeing actually a profit or some kind of a positive return out of this investment, right? But there's another side of the coin, which is the negative side. And I don't mean that's a bad side. I mean negative in the sense from a financial draw on it, right, is the TCO, or the total cost of ownership. And that's very important to understand too. Now, what I mean by that when I say total cost of ownership, it's really important that, especially as a small and medium business, that you understand what is it going to take financially to actually run this project. And it's not just financially, by the way. That also includes man hours. It includes staffing requirements sometimes. And it includes a lot of attention and missed opportunity or opportunity cost on other efforts. Because as a small and medium business, you only have so many resources and so many people. If you task people to focus on this, right, whether it's 100% of the time or just, an X percentage of the time, well, that's time that they cannot spend somewhere else. All of that stuff factors into total cost of ownership. The other thing I'll add too, when it comes to the technology side, don't forget to think about things like support costs, maintenance costs, upgrading and updating the software. By the way, all of these things I'm talking about, this is why people really, really like SaaS models, software as a service, because generally speaking, there are no hidden gotchas that are going to impact your total cost of ownership, because really with SaaS licensing, you get the updates, you get the support, follow the sun support from, assuming you're purchasing something from a mature SaaS company. That's why people really like that model, because they know if I spend X dollars a month or whatever my agreement is, right, I know all the updates are going to come and this and that. So I don't have to factor in the additional development costs for updating later, things like that.